there, fiber junkies! Welcome back to the Color Cauldron. I'm Johanna, the owner and dyer behind Potion Yarns and host of this podcast. If you haven't checked out my online shop yet, click the first link in the description box below and it'll take you to my website, www.potionyarns.com, and you can check out all of my hand-dyed yarns and fiber and kind of see what my company is about. Today we are going to continue with our wool series that we started several weeks ago. Each week we're taking a different breed of sheep that we use for hand knitting yarns in particular, and we're discussing its characteristics, what it's good for, what kind of things you'd want to blend it with, what kind of projects you'd want to use it for, etc. We've already tackled merino and blueface Leicester, and today we're going to talk about another fine wool. So we're going to jump right in. Today we're going to talk about Cormo. Cormo is a fine wool, and it is a descendant of merino, which we've already talked about on the podcast. And today we're going to look a little bit at how this breed came about and what it's good for. So there was a guy named Ian Downey. He was a farmer in Tasmania, Australia, and he had some superfine Saxon merino sheep, and he wanted to create a breed that would have more fertility and create more lambs from their births and everything. So he wanted something that would create more sheep, but also have the characteristics of a fine wool that would make really great wool for weaving and knitting and various different home crafts, but also would have good meat quality production, because I think due to where he was at, he needed to have something that would be the most versatile sheep that he could. So just as much valued for its meat quality as for its fleece quality. So he took some Saxon merino sheep and crossbred them with some Corriedale, which is another breed we haven't talked about yet, but we will. And the resulting lambs became the Cormo sheep. Hence, Corriedale, merino, Cormo. That's how we get that. So that was in the early 1960s. So it's a relatively new breed. It hasn't been around for that long. And then it was introduced to the United States in 1976. So Cormo is a fine wool, like I mentioned, which, if you need a quick refresher, fine wool basically refers to the staple length and how dense or fine the locks of hair are on the sheep. So we talked about microns back in the intro podcast where we just talked about what is wool and some of the characteristics of wool. So if you need a refresher, go back and look at that podcast. But Cormo wool has 17 to 23 microns is kind of the range you'll find it in. If you can recall, that's right around the same range as merino. Merino, I think, was 16 to 21, something like that. So this is just about as fine as merino. It's very, very soft. It's great for next to the skin wear. It's definitely something you could use for sensitive skin and baby knits, as long as they're not allergic to wool. It does have a really high fine crimp. So it's not going to be the undulating waves of the BFL sheep. It's going to be more like a merino, where it's a really high, tight, fine crimp. The locks themselves are very, very warm and squishy, very, very soft. And I have not handled any raw fleece that hasn't been spun into yarn yet from a Cormo sheep, so I can't tell you this from personal experience, but in my research I was reading several people online were saying that it has a really unique feel to the locks. So if you are one of those lucky people that has been able to spin or just feel some locks of Cormo fleece, you'll have to let me know in the comments if I'm right about this. But they were saying that it's got a really unique hand and it feels similar to merino, but it's actually more, one person actually said more moist. I think Clara Parks mentioned in her book of wool that it was more moist than merino, which I don't really know what she means by that. But someone else said it just feels more like dense and velvety while still being really light and lofty. But compared to merino, there's more texture to it and it's more velvety and more, it just kind of makes you want to put it against your cheek and rub it. And I just thought that sounded amazing. Like, don't you just want to go grab some Cormo wool and play with it now? I sure do. I've never actually gotten to knit with it, so it's going on my to knit list and I'm going to be keeping an eye out for that. But yeah, it just sounds really amazing to work with. For spinners, if you're interested in spinning this wool, it has a 2.5 to 4 inch staple length, so pretty short staple length, which actually makes it challenging to spin. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. And it has a low luster. And does anyone remember what luster is? We talked about this briefly in some of our previous episodes. Basically, luster is the shine of the yarn. So how reflective it is, whether if it has a low luster, it's got more of like a matte finish and more of an opaque kind of density to the colors. A higher luster would be something that's got a lot of light reflection and shine so that it has that just really liquidy quality. For example, if you've seen silk yarns or any blend that has at least 20% silk in it, you'll know that silk has a very high luster. So if you look in my shop, my Fairy Wing blend is 80% merino, 20% silk. And you can tell that if you've ever purchased that yarn, or even in some of the pictures, you can tell it just has more of a shiny kind of quality to the colors. It absorbs the dye beautifully, and it has a really clear, bright intensity to the colors that the non-silk wools don't seem to have as much. So anything that has a really high luster is going to have that really reflective, shiny kind of quality. This Cormo breed has more of a low luster, so it's going to be more of like that kind of dense, rich. It still saturates with color beautifully and still has a really rich color, but it's not going to be as reflective and shiny. It's going to be more of like an opaque kind of finish. It is good for felting, so you can use Cormo wool for felting as long as it has not been superwash treated. And it can be spun either worsted or woolen, which we're going to talk about in a later episode down the road after the wool series is over. So if you're not sure what that means, don't worry about it too much, or just go Google it. But for those of you that are interested in spinning the fiber, you will probably know what that means. And so that gives you a lot more variety in what you can do, because it really works well either way. However, it can be challenging to spin. One of the things that I came across in my research was that even a lot of large commercial mills that have really good reputations working with different sheep breeds find Cormo really tricky to spin, because the short staple length and the fineness of the crimp combine to make it really challenging, in that you have to keep a very, very tight, even tension when you're spinning. So if you're not super even in your tension, like I've only been spinning for a little over a year, and while that sounds like a long time, I am not good about practicing. Like I haven't picked up my drop spindle in probably 4 months, which is terrible, but I got really discouraged and kind of laid off of it for a while, and I need to get it back out. But so I'm still very much a beginner, and so my tension is all over the board. I really struggle to keep even tension. So I would definitely have some super lumpy art yarn out of my Cormo. I have super lumpy art yarn out of everything I've tried to spin so far. But for those of you that are more experienced, I'm sure you could definitely do it, but just be aware that it is really tricky, and you have to keep that really firm, even tension on it to try and avoid the lumps. And even doing that, it's quite likely you're going to get some lumps in there. One thing that seems to be a common thread with most yarns, even commercially spun yarns from Cormo, is that they have a bit more of a lumpy, uneven finish to the spin, but it doesn't seem to take away from the finished objects. It seems like you can easily hide those lumps in your knitting, because they will block out really nicely, and it's as long as it's been spun decently well by an experienced hand spinner or a commercial company. It might be a little lumpy when you first wind it into a cake and start knitting with it, but once you have it knit up and you block it and wear it, you're not really going to notice the lumps really. It's just going to add kind of a fluffy, lofty texture. It's not going to be like, oh look, here's a super uneven stitch or a really lumpy finished sweater or whatever it is. It's going to look okay either way. So it's not something you need to be super concerned about if you buy a skein at your local yarn store and it seems a little lumpy in your hand. I wouldn't worry about it. I would still knit a swatch and test it, but I wouldn't worry about it because it seems like most people online who have a lot more experience knitting with it than I do seem to think that that's actually kind of part of its charm, and that you don't really notice the lumps when it's all knit up. But that might be why it looks a little bit less, it looks a bit more rustic perhaps than the merino that you'll find in your local yarn store. So just a heads up if you're looking for some Cormo. I haven't seen a lot of Cormo in my local yarn store actually. So this is something, I'll be honest, I haven't sought it out, and I'm planning to do that now that I've done, when I was doing my research on the podcast, I was like, this sounds really cool, and now I really want to knit with it, and I really want to touch some raw fiber. I kind of want to try spinning it, but honestly I'm not really good enough to have confidence. So I'm probably just going to touch the fiber and try to find some already spun yarn to play with. But it does sound really intriguing, so I really want to try it. And I think you should too. So go to your local yarn store or do a Google search and see if you can find any Cormo yarn for sale. And then let me know how it goes. Send me an email or drop me a comment in the comments below. Let me know how your Cormo experiences go. If you have already knit with Cormo, please leave a comment and let us know what you liked about it, what you didn't like, any other information that I didn't cover in the podcast today that will help us when we are looking for yarns as well. I would love to hear what you guys think about Cormo. So I hope that was a nice little intro for you today. That's all I had to talk about Cormo. Unfortunately, like I said, I haven't knit with it, so I don't have any samples to show you. I don't have any finished objects to show you. I do have a finished object to show you, however, that is not Cormo. It's merino, but I was excited to show you, and you may have already noticed because I'm wearing them. I finished my Lady Lallybroch mitts. I did talk about these on the podcast several weeks ago, and I actually finished them several weeks ago, and then they just sat around and didn't get blocked in my huge pile of finished objects that need to be blocked and have the ends woven in, because I'm terrible about finishing. So, especially about blocking, like weaving in ends is not my favorite, but I can just turn on a movie and sit there and do it as long as I'm in the right mood. Sometimes I have to do it in spurts and like do a few ends and then set it aside, knit on something, come back to it later, but I can do it. It's the blocking that really gets to me. And part of that is because I don't have a lot of space to lay out big projects like huge shawls. Like when I blocked my oracle, it was a mess because it was so huge. So I don't have a lot of space. I don't have a lot of patience for it, honestly, and I'm not a fan of blocking. I definitely think it's essential on lace pieces. Certain objects you absolutely have to do it, and these were one of the ones that I probably wouldn't have had to, but I really wanted a specific shape on the finished glove, so I decided to go ahead and block it. But I am the queen of finding ways to not block things. Like my U-Rock shawl that I showed on the podcast, I think it was last week. I did not block that baby at all, not a single bit of blocking, and I love it. It's perfect because it uses the brioche rib and garter stitch, so neither of those are curling or bunched up kind of fabrics. There's no lace to spread out in it that you need to like spread out and really open up, so it was perfectly fine the way it was. So I was a huge fan of that shawl because not only was it fun to knit, relatively easy, and I just love those stinking tassels, but it didn't require any blocking. So if you're not a fan of blocking, go knit the U-Rock shawl. But these ones I did block, and really the only reason I blocked them, they wouldn't have needed it because they laid flat perfectly on their own, but I needed to open up this cuff because when you first knit it, you can see how it kind of bells out like that. When you first knit it, it's more just like straight and the ribbon kind of hugs in and it just kind of goes like this. So if you want it to be really tight and not have that fan shape, you wouldn't even need to block these. But I wanted that very like old-fashioned kind of gauntlet fan shape at the cuff. So I went ahead and just gently spread it. You do want to be careful when you're blocking ribbing, however. I wanted it to be blocked into that fan shape, but I didn't want it to be pulled so tight that I was stretching the yarn and causing extra stress and damage. And I also didn't want to lose the like bouncy, soft, plump feel of the ribbing because you do a 4x3 ribbing. So I didn't want to lose that nice bouncy plumpness. So I made sure that I spread it out just a little, but that I didn't overstretch it so that the fibers still have a lot of life and bounce and spring to them. So you want to be very careful blocking ribbing. It's something that's really tricky. And then the top part, I didn't even block at all. I just laid it flat and then just blocked the bell shape because this lovely little slip stitch pattern on the hand is really, really great at just laying flat on its own. It didn't need anything. And then I finished mine off, just like in the pattern, I actually did my Lady Lallybroch mitts a bit differently. And if you find my project page on Ravelry, I think I need to update what I did on the crochet bind off, but in the pattern, she has you crochet around the thumb loop as you're knitting, and then I didn't do that because when I was knitting these, I was at a yarn show and I didn't have a crochet hook with me, so I just left that part and then came back and did the crochet later, and I just did a single crochet around the thumb hole, and then I did 2 rounds of single crochet on the fingers because just one seemed a little too small for me and I wanted it just a little taller, so I did 2 rounds there instead of 1. But other than that, I pretty much followed the pattern with a few adjustments to the size, which again you can find in my project page. I am posting yarns on Ravelry as well. And these are the Lady Lallybroch mitts. They were inspired by Outlander, which is a really fun show that I've only seen the first season to. But I loved it. I really want to watch the rest. I don't have TV, and we don't keep a whole lot of streaming. We have a couple like Netflix and We currently have Hulu because it came with our phone package with Sprint when we signed up, but we wouldn't have bought it on our own. So I don't keep a lot of streaming services, and we don't have TV at all in our house. Like we have a DVD player and a TV, but we don't have any TV service hooked up. So I didn't keep up with it when it came out. I had to get it at the library, and there was always a wait list, and so I haven't watched beyond the first season, but I loved the first season, and I'm dying to go back, and I want to start it over from the beginning and watch the whole thing. And I've never read the books, which is also on my to-do list. Everyone keeps telling me to read the books, so I promise it's on the library list. I just haven't gotten to it. But yeah, I really loved these gloves, and so I will pop a link to that pattern in below. You can find it on Ravelry. It's really fun and a really quick knit, so I highly recommend it. I will say this was designed for worsted weight or Aran weight yarn, and I actually used a DK weight on mine, and so I think you can easily substitute a DK. You might need to jigger the numbers a little bit, but honestly, I was working off of the smallest size in the pattern, and my hands are just really tiny, so I was working off the smallest size and it was still too big, so I ended up ripping out and going back and readjusting my numbers, which again, you can find all that in my project page on Ravelry. If you have tiny hands, you might want to adjust the numbers, and you can use mine as kind of a clue on how to get started. But you might just need to knit it for yourself and see if you need to play around with the numbers if you change the yarn. I thought I might have to go up a size because I used DK instead of worsted, but I kept the same needle size, I think. I don't remember, but it's all in the project page notes. But yeah, I didn't really actually end up needing to do that because I felt like even her small size was really quite large. I would have said it was more of a medium to large size for women's hands. So you might need to play around with the numbers if you have tiny hands. But that's all I have to tell you guys today. Just Cormo review and show off my new mitts that I'm really proud of. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and it is now time to cast off. Love you.